Hello everybody, today I wanted to cover the patterns that you can get in a ball python. Now we've had this idea in mind since we did our video on the colors that you can get in ball pythons, but there is a very big difference which I need to lay out before we get started. Now with colors, there's actual science behind it. There are primary colors and secondary colors and basically a lot of shades of those secondary colors all in between. With patterns, there's not as much of that. Obviously patterns exist in nature, but a pattern is basically a repeated decorative design. And decorative says it all. It's creative, it's art. So art isn't necessarily science. There is an infinite number of patterns. I can't say these are the primary patterns, but there are popular patterns. There's obvious patterns that we know of, that we think of. As I say that word, there are certain things that come into your mind. So that is what I'm going to be covering. I'm going to be covering some of the more common patterns that we can think of. The first pattern I wanted to talk about would be lines. Now you might think lines would be more boring or vanilla, but ball pythons got it nailed when it comes to this. One of the first things I think of when I think of lines in a ball python would be the lines you get in freeways and highways, which would be your yellow belly complex jeans. I really love these, and so do a ton of other people, because it lives up to its name. It looks like the lines on a freeway or a highway. You've got the broken up lines that you would see when you're able to pass somebody. Another one ironically would be super yellow belly or ivory, which mostly is going to show you an all white snake with black eyes. But if you add just one more gene, sometimes I find that it has a nearly perfect, very faint stripe running down its back. Even in the case of our blue-eyed leucistic here, she has a faint line going down nearly her entire back. Another example of lines would be pinstripe, which almost look like very small pen marks on the snake. Now none of these are precisely straight, but they are very thin lines that exist on your snake, creating a very unique pattern. Another really good example would be the genetic stripe. This gives a bigger, bolder stripe down the entirety of the snake's back in most cases. On that G stripe, and especially our next gene, are very heavily underrated genes in and of themselves, but this is a really good way to get a very bold, nice stripe down the entirety of your snake. And the last one I wanted to call attention to would be tri-stripe. This is probably one of my favorite of them. Now, I noticed that in most cases, at least the ones that I look at, don't seem to have the stripe go down the entirety of it, but the stripe is even bolder, and it does something with a lot of contrast. You get the nice big bold stripe down the back, but then the other pattern comes in as a smaller, wavier stripe on each side of the back of your snake as well, creating the name tri-stripe. So that is one of the better ones in my opinion, especially with how much bolder it is and how unique it is to its pattern. Again, a very heavily underrated gene in my opinion, one that I would very much like to see people start working with a lot more. The next pattern I'd like to talk about, which is also somewhat common, would be circles. One of the more common ones that I think of would be Mojave and Mystic, which are incredibly similar genes. I have a Mystic here, and sure enough, it has circles on it as well. In fact, it kind of out of order says the name of my son, which is odd and unique. But these ones get quite a few circles on them. It turns those alien heads more into what we call like keyholes. So again, it's not exactly a perfect circle, but it's about as close as you can get. They're more like hearts, I would say, but they are a circular shape. There's actually a gene out there just called circle. This is a super circle that I'm looking at here, but it definitely creates these little circular patterns as opposed to the alien heads that you normally get. And here's a banana cinnamon one. Again, these are little circles that appear all over the snake in regards to its pattern. But in my mind, when I think of circles in terms of a high-end morph, would be the Kraken that was made by Canova. They thought that it looked like the little suction cups of the Kraken. They have a lot of these cool, unique little circles on it as well. Of course, the coloration and such really do a lot of favors for how beautiful this snake looks as well, but it certainly does hit the mark of having little circles all over it. The next pattern that I wanted to discuss, which is very popular, would be a checkered pattern. And no, there's not a checkered pattern in ball python. That would be something if we could create a checkered ball python. But in the meantime, the closest I think we're gonna get is puzzle. You look at puzzle here and it looks like little puzzle pieces. So it is very random in terms of where they appear. So it isn't exactly a checkerboard, but I'd say that it's the closest thing I can think to it. We actually just got into puzzle this year ourselves. But again, no checkered ball pythons. Another one that you can't really get too much in terms of is like crisscrosses or X's. This can happen sometimes, maybe on like a pinstripe, maybe just in general. If you're looking at your snake in the right direction, you could technically say that you pointed out an X, but there's no real rhyme or reason in how you can actually bring it into your snake. There's no real way that you're gonna get a bunch of X's next to each other on your ball python, for example. Spider actually might be one of the ones that you can actually get an X on more. Like in this example right here of just your standard spider, if you rotate the snake, it's basically a bunch of X's next to each other. It is really too bad, the bad rap that this gene gets. I really hope that people can start working with spiders maybe to work out the wobbles, because it is an incredibly unique pattern, and in a way it kind of does do the X's and blocking. There's a lot of pattern to this snake. By the way, if at any point someone knows of any, can think of any, by all means sound off in the comments. Next up would be dots, and yes, you can definitely get ball pythons with dots on them. Leopard is thought to have kind of a leopardy type stripes and stuff like that, but I see a lot of leopards with dots. The Batman ball pythons, which is clown, leopard, and spot nose, often have little dots on the side as well, as you can see in this one right here. In fact, this one has a perfect little dot right on the head. And just to clarify, dots and circles I'm kind of separating a little bit, because dots are different than circles, is that it's just one solid circle, and it's usually smaller, versus a circle being hollow in the middle typically. As you can see here, this is a perfect example of one with little polka dots all over it. It is a spot nose clown with some yellow belly and OD in there as well. It's got a perfect little dot on its head, and it's got dots speckling the sides of it. But leopard brings a lot of that to the table. Again, going back to monsoon, you either have like a bunch of very small wavy lines like confetti, or a bunch of little teeny dots. Another very unique example would be older banana or coral glow ball pythons. These, as they age, tend to get a bunch of little teeny black spots that come onto them, almost like a ripening banana, which is partially the reason why they get their name and their yellow coloring. These ones are very unique in that it's something that develops much later in their life as a drastic change in their appearance happens. This usually happens in just standard bananas. The more genes you add, I find the less of the polka dots, so to speak, that you get on them. I get a lot of back and forth whether people like it or not. I guess it just depends for me. I kind of like the uniqueness of it. I like the little polka dots that come through. However, I can definitely see why in certain combos and certain things that I'm trying to create, I'd rather it maybe not, but I think it's incredibly unique. The next pattern that I think is an incredibly popular one would be plaid. Moving on to zigzags or spider webs, or what is commonly known as chevron. Let's just call it webs. Spider, obviously, is what it's named for. It does have a sort of wavy zigzag type line on it quite often, especially when you put it with other things. Enchi does this quite often as well. Enchi is really good at just reducing the pattern and thus creating very wavy kind of lines. One of the cooler ones I think that has this kind of up and down crazy pattern would be the zebra. The zebra morph is still relatively new, but they create this almost like zipper pattern down it, but it is incredibly unique. And what I really like about it is that down the back of it, it's almost like it's off-centered. You see here in the middle, it almost looks like that pattern got broken up right in the middle of it, almost like a chimera ball python would, almost like it's paradoxed or something, and that it's brought over to the left ever so slightly, and it's just perfectly off-center, and then it looked like it was just glued together incorrectly, just off, like just a hair. I think that's incredibly unique. I don't see that anywhere else, but you get it a lot in zebra. Can you get diamond patterns on a ball python? Well, you might think I'm gonna say no, but I really think you can. It's just not in the place that you'd think. The heads of certain enchis, super enchis, and clowns is what I'm talking about here. This one's here not exactly like I would say a perfect diamond, but it does create an arrowhead. But you can see these kind of diamondish like patterns on a lot of enchis' heads, especially like super enchi. Sometimes when you go into clowns as well, you get a lot of crazy patterns in clowns. And on that, with diamond, I'm kind of referring to this as even like a half a diamond. Sometimes you get that quite often with these arrowhead like looks on enchis especially. Diamonds are not a super common thing to get. There's no way to guarantee that your super enchi is going to show a very nice diamond, but regardless, it is somewhat represented in terms of patterns on ball pythons. Continuing to our next pattern, let's talk about wavy lines. And Honestly, it's everywhere. We've kind of already discussed a lot of them. With tri-stripe, a lot of those are just wavy lines, just wavy patterns. Normals have wavy lines and patterns on them because no normal is actually normal. You know that, right? We discussed our monarch in the past near the end of a lot of the hets and near the end of the tails of even the visual monarch. They kind of just start becoming more or less a just hilly type wavy pattern at the end. Spider has wavy lines, pinstripe, monsoon. Wavy lines are everywhere. Those are some of the more common patterns, but what's so cool about ball pythons is that their patterns don't need to fit any of this. Their patterns are incredibly unique. They're super diverse. Sometimes we can see things that we want to see or see certain patterns in them that look like something, but sometimes something doesn't need to be defined to be awesome. And that's what we see a lot in these ball pythons. It doesn't need to have a definition. And with pattern, there is no definition. You can make up a pattern right now. It's a completely artistic concept, which is awesome because everything that you make has one, and every single snake you make is unique in terms of its pattern. Yes, we want to achieve certain patterns sometimes, but sometimes chaos is king. If you like this video, you can actually check out our previous video on colors in ball pythons, which is a lot more structured right here. Like in this pastel puzzle here. But again, no checkered ball pythons. Checkmate. That was corny as fuck. That's also chess. Whatever, they're played on the same board.